Hey everybody! In today's tutorial, we're going to go over a topic that trips up a lot of developers, CSS position. Using CSS position, you can visually lay out the elements on your website. For example, you can position an element at the very top of your page or 50 pixels below the element before it. The position property can take on 5 different values: static, relative, absolute, fixed, and sticky. In addition, you can utilize some other position-related properties: top, right, bottom, and left. This might sound like a lot, but don't worry. We'll be going over each position value, what it means, and see just how it works in the code. Lastly, if you'd rather go through this by reading an article, I have a text version of this tutorial on my blog, coder-coder.com. I have it linked below in the description if you're interested. Without further ado, let's get into CSS position. The first position we're going to look at is position static. You may not have heard of this, but position static is actually the default value that an element will have, which means that if you don't actually declare the position property for an element in the CSS, it'll automatically be set to static when you open it in your browser. So what does static mean exactly? Well, elements that are statically positioned will appear on the page in what we call the normal flow. Let's see this illustrated a bit more closely in our CodePen here. So we have here 2 elements. We have a purple element and a green element, and both of them are statically positioned. If we look at the CSS, we can see that the parent purple element doesn't actually have a position property set, but like we said earlier, if it's not set, the browser just assumes it's position static. The green element with another class is explicitly positioned to have the static value of the position property. So this is just 2 different ways that you can assign position static to elements. Now, you might have noticed that the green element also has a top property of 50 pixels. Seeing that, you might have thought that maybe the green element should be 50 pixels under the purple element with, a space of 50 pixels between them. However, it's not having any effect. This is because statically positioned elements do just follow the natural flow of the document, and any of those layout properties like top, right, bottom, or left are not going to have any effect on static elements. If you want that control, you need to make sure the element has its position set, meaning it needs to be set to anything other than static. Now, I've never in my experience purposely set an element to have position static, but it's good to know because it does exist, and if you don't set position, it's going to be static. So one good tip that I have is if you notice that your elements aren't exactly performing or behaving the way that you want them to be in layout, you might want to go back and just double check the CSS and to see if it has its position set to something not static, like position relative. And this brings us to our next position, position relative. Position relative is pretty similar to static in that relatively positioned elements will follow the normal flow of the web page. But the main difference is that using relative will now unlock those other CSS layout properties that we talked about. You can think about it this way. When you're setting an element to be position relative, you're making it position relative to its default view on the page, i.e. the static positioning. So let's go back into our CodePen and see what difference this will make when we set that green element to be position relative as opposed to position static. So we're just going to go in here, change the static to relative, and save. And now we can see that that top of 50 pixels is now actually working on the element, and it's positioned 50 pixels below where it was before under the purple parent element. All right, let's look at another example of using position relative that we see all the time on websites, where you have a parent element and then you have a child element inside that parent element. So let's go into our markup here, and we're just going to create a child element nested inside the parent element. So we'll just give it a CSS class of child. Let's give it a different color. I think I have a magenta set up. And then we'll close that div, of course. And then we'll just add a little bit of labeling so it's a bit easier to identify it. Okay, so now we have our parent and child element. So let's just go into the CSS and make sure that both the parent and child elements are position relative. So we'll add a new declaration for the child class and make that position relative as well. And let's add some of those other layout properties. Let's say top of 0 pixels and left of 0 pixels. All right, so we can see that the pink child element is nicely nested inside the purple parent element. And the child is also positioned as close to the top and left inside the parent as is possible due to the top and left properties. It'll go up just as far as the parent text, but it won't overlap it because they're both position relative. So this is pretty straightforward, right? Okay, let's move on to something that trips up so many developers, and it's position absolute. So what is position absolute? Well, if you set an element to be position absolute, it causes the element to be completely taken out of that normal flow of the web page. All right, so let's kind of unpack that. What does that mean? Okay, if you remember before, when we were using static or relative positioning, the elements would be nicely displayed one below the other, depending on their order, in the HTML markup. But with absolute positioning, that element is completely taken out of that entire flow. So let's try to kind of illustrate this with our code pen again. And we're going to look at the differences between position relative and position absolute. So let's go to our child element CSS, and we're going to change it from position relative to position absolute. And we'll just see how that changes and how it's displayed. Okay, so you can see this looks pretty different from how it was before, where when it was position relative, it was just kind of nicely nested inside the parent element, but not overlapping anything. But now the child is completely even covering up the parent element, and it's positioned at the very top and left of that parent. And this is because it has been taken out of that normal flow of the document and combined with the top and the left properties that we had. So since this child element is absolutely positioned, it's essentially operating on a different layer than the normal elements, the normal flow of that document. So you can use this to position an element on top of everything else that's on the web page. But one other thing to note is that this child element is staying within the boundaries of the parent element. And that will happen as long as the parent element has its position set to anything other than static. And that kind of leads us to our next point, because there's one other really tricky aspect to child elements with absolute positioning. And that is when you take an element out of the normal flow by using position absolute, it's actually going to look for an ancestor element that has its own position set, because the child element needs some element that it can position itself in relation to. And let's see what that looks like. So what happens if this child element, which is positioned absolutely, has a parent element which doesn't have its position set, meaning it's set to position static? So let's comment this position relative of the parent element out and see what it looks like. Okay, so you can see now that before the child element was kind of within the bounds of the parent element, but now it's completely outside and it's kind of broken out of the boundaries. And this is because the parent has no position set. So the child element is going to keep going up that tree, and it's going up to the next grandparent element, which in this case is just the body element, which is as far as it can go. And this is a huge cause of unexpected behavior in CSS for a lot of developers. I know that it's happened to me, and I'm always like, whoa, why did this element just fly up out of the page? So if you can just remember to always set the parent element of an absolutely positioned child to make sure it has position relative or position absolute set, then in most cases you're going to avoid that problem of having your child element fly up to somewhere. So let's just kind of summarize relative and absolute positioning right now. The main difference between relative and absolute positioning is that position absolute is going to take a child element completely out of the normal flow of the document, and the child is going to be positioned in relation to the first parent element that has its own position set. So these last two position values that we're going to look at, position fixed and position sticky, they are similar in some ways to position absolute, but they're also related to the scroll position that you have on the page. So let's take a look at that. Position fixed is going to take the element out of that normal flow of the document, kind of like position absolute. And in addition to that, it's going to, you'll be able to position the element using those layout properties like, top and left. And wherever you position it, it's going to be fixed in that position no matter where you scroll down the page. This is a little bit easier to see rather than just read about. So let's kind of go into our code here and make these elements, make this green element be fixed. So we'll change position relative to position fixed, and now you can see that it is fixed to the top of 50 pixels. Let's just make that 0, and let's also make it left 0. So this looks actually like the child element when we made that absolute positioning, and the parent didn't have its position set. But we can see the difference if we copy this lorem ipsum text and put it into the parent element div, so that we'll have to scroll. So now you can see, whereas before, let's just remove that for a second. So before, the green element was just below the purple element, but now that it's fixed to the top and to the left, it's going to be in that position in your viewport no matter where you scroll. So one thing to remember with position fixed is that you do need to have some of these layout properties set. Otherwise, if you don't, you can see that the element doesn't even exist on the page. So that's one big difference between position fixed and position absolute, that it does need, at least the top position set, or one of those positions set. So let's try if we just get rid of the top. Looks like it doesn't appear either, so you need either the top or the bottom. One thing to keep in mind with position fixed elements is that they do need to have either the top or the bottom set. If it doesn't, then let me just show you what will happen here. So we've commented out that top property and it disappeared, and even when we scroll down, the element's not there at all. So you do need to have either the top or it could be also bottom, but one of those needs to be set in order for the element to basically exist on the page. And position fixed, one really common application of that is using it to make those navigation bars. So we might want to say 100% width, and then the element's always going to be on top no matter what. So this is really handy if you have one of those fixed navigations. And of course that brings us to the last position option that we'll be going into, which is position sticky. And sticky elements will initially behave like position relative elements in that they will appear on the page like normal, and if you scroll up a little bit, they'll scroll up with you. But once you hit that point where they would scroll off the page, they will turn into basically position fixed elements. And just like position fixed, you do need to have either the top or bottom set. And then from that point on, once you keep scrolling, it will just stay fixed to wherever you fixed it. So let's see what that looks like in the code. So we're going to take our green fixed element right now, and we're going to change that position fixed to position sticky. And keep in mind, we do have our top of 0 pixels set. So you can see it looks like it disappeared, but what happened was because it's appearing below the first purple div, it right now is behaving as a position relative element. So actually what we need to do is add some more content below that green element so we can sort of see how it becomes fixed when you keep scrolling down. So I'm just going to copy that first purple element, paste it down here, and then let's try again. So we'll scroll, and we see the green element here. And then once it hits a top, you can see that it sort of sticks to the top. And that's because of that top 0 pixels. And just for experiment's sake, what happens if you comment out that top, it's just going to behave like regular position relative and it never becomes fixed. Now, you may have noticed that when I scrolled up, this second purple element actually looks like it's going on top of the green sticky element, which when it's fixed. And that's not really what you want to happen if you have a sticky nav that you want to fix to the top. So why does that happen? Well, I'm not going to go super in depth into this, but this is because of the z-index property. And if we look in our CSS, none of these elements have the z-index set, but they're all position. So the purple elements, they're the parent class. They have position relative, and then the green element is position sticky. So just like the position property, even if you don't set it, the browser is going to sort of have some default setting. So by default, if you don't have any z-index set, it's going to sort of use this hierarchy of order on the page to determine, what will go on top of the other elements. So because the first purple element is first, the green sticky element will go on top of that, if need be, when it becomes sticky. And then the second purple element, because it's after that green element, is going to be on top of the green element itself. So it's just an order thing. But, if you don't set z-index and you're wondering what's going on, it could be due to that. So one way that we get more control around that is we're going to set the green element to have a z-index. So we'll just say z-index of 1. So now the green element has z-index, the purple elements do not. So let's see what happens. So now we can see when we scroll, the green element will stay on top of the second purple element. And basically the way z-index works is you can set the z-index to any number, so it can be a positive or a negative number or 0. And the higher the number, the more to the top that element's going to be in the order. It does get a bit complicated when you have, a whole bunch of nested elements at different levels and things like that. But I think that may be a topic for another tutorial. But for now, you can just know that if you set a z-index number of this green element, it's going to be on top of any of the other elements that don't have it set. So that is position sticky. One thing to know about position sticky is that it's a pretty new feature. Obviously, it's a very cool thing you can do in CSS, but because it's new, it doesn't have complete support across the board in older browsers. So one thing that you can check is you go to caniuse.com, and let's just see what the browser support is for sticky. Okay, so we got position sticky here, and caniuse.com, it's like a super helpful website. It just tells you, what features are supported in what browsers. So you can see here, the only, completely green browsers are the newer Firefoxes, Safari, iOS Safari, even Chrome. It looks like it has partial support, not complete, and older versions do not have any support. And one thing to note in particular is that none of the Internet Explorer browsers have support. And this may depend on your work situation or your clients, but I wouldn't use position sticky at the moment just because, there are some people who are still using IE11 due to, their work computers and their company. They just haven't upgraded their entire company yet. So depending on your work situation, you may need to hold off on using it on production websites. But obviously the support's going to improve as the browsers get newer and get updated and stuff. So yeah, so that's basically it. That's all these CSS positions. I really hope that you found this tutorial helpful. If you have any questions or feedback, feel free to leave a comment below. And yeah, like and follow if you enjoyed this. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.